and welcome to the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands Culture and Heritage Series. In each video, you'll explore Caymanian culture and heritage while learning curricular topics in science, technology, engineering, art, math, and social studies. Along the way, you'll meet local artists to see how these themes have inspired their creative work. In today's video, we'll be learning about the history of turtling in the Cayman Islands. Turtle meat was a primary source of food and income for Caymanian societies for centuries, dating from before permanent settlement of the Cayman Islands, when passing ships in need of fresh meat indulged in the island's abundance of turtles. Let's hear more from Geddes Hislop, Curator of Terrestrial Exhibits and Education Programs at the Cayman Turtle Centre.
About sea turtles, the Cayman Islands, historically, was one of the largest sea turtle rookeries in the entire Caribbean. They estimate there are about 2 million sea turtles around these islands in pre-Columbian times. So that's a lot of animals. And what brought them here is that the Cayman Islands have perfect conditions for green sea turtles, which are the marine herbivores. And the sounds that we have, the shallow coastal waters with lots of seagrass beds, that's what attracted them. And this was significant because it meant that for Europeans coming to the Caribbean, this was a very important stopover point, to replenish meat supplies. So from the time Columbus's ships came here, the story is basically that they were sailing past the sister islands and they noticed all these lumps in the water. They thought they actually hit a reef. It turned out to be hundreds and hundreds of turtles in the water. So that's why they call it Las Tortugas, for all the sea turtles. So what they did was, when they saw these turtles, they figured they didn't see turtles, beautiful swimming animals. They saw fresh meat. Because these ships coming across the Atlantic, they took about, 2-3 months across, and they had meat supplies, which was basically salted or pickled beef and pork, and that stuff went rancid really easily. So they decided to replenish by catching a few turtles. That word spread. Once they realized that and they logged where the islands were, they kept coming back to replenish turtles because turtles were easy meat. They turn them upside down in the boat and they would live for a long time. And of course, these turtles, they call them green turtles because when they open them up, their body fat is green instead of yellow. And that became a major replenishment source, not only for the Spanish ships at the time, but all the other European nations once they got wind of it. The English, the Dutch, the French, Portuguese, all of them, they did the same thing. They stopped at the Cayman Islands. Some historians will say that because of the green sea turtle in particular, and why the green sea turtle? Because that's one of the few turtle species that will actually congregate in groups. Most other turtles are solitary, but greens would congregate in big groups that they call bales. And because of the green turtle and that ready source, you think about it, entering the Caribbean, from the time you pass between Cuba and Hispaniola, you hit the Cayman Islands, and then you have the rest of the Caribbean. So they had a replenishment spot that enabled them to penetrate the rest of the islands, to fuel colonialism, if you think of it that way. So that's why sea turtles were so important. The Europeans, from that tradition, when people settled the islands, they kept it going because there was an actual market back in Europe for sea turtle meat. It was considered an exotic meat like venison. It was a sign of prestige to be able to serve turtle the Caribbean way. Because of that market, people that actually settled the Cayman Islands in the late 1700s, they kept that tradition going. So much so that ships would call from Jamaica, which was the main colony, to Cayman to collect turtles to take to Europe. And that evolved into the Caymanians doing their own thing. Because of the few resources they had in the island, they didn't have much in terms of the economy. They did some coconuts, some sea island cotton, thatch rope. They returned to the sea for their real economy. So shipbuilding and seamanship and eventually turtle ranging became the main economy. In the early 1800s, they estimated that 83% of the population were directly or indirectly involved in the turtling industry. And that's where that thing evolved from. The greens and the hawksbills were the main targets. Greens especially so. But interestingly, the two sets of islands had different targets. Grand Caymanians mostly went after the greens. People in the sister islands mostly went after hawksbills for different reasons. They utilized the whole animal. But for hawksbills, there was also a second industry with the shell, making jewelry and trinkets and that kind of thing. The greens, not so much. The greens were more for meat because they're huge. They're huge animals. They were pulling up turtles easily close to 500 pounds. And these things were providing a lot of meat, plus the shell, bones, the fat. They rendered the fat to make grease and oil for lamps. They use the meat, the belly shell, which they call the plastron, to make soup and gums and all kinds of things. Right? Hawksbills apparently don't taste as well as the greens. So their meat wasn't so much in demand as their shell, but they had the most beautiful shells. So each one had its own reasons for hunting each. By the time the turtling industry really took off in the Cayman Islands, or became a thing in the Cayman Islands, the sea turtles were gone. The Europeans had literally hunted them out. Most people think the Caymanian turtles did it, but no. Their records show that by the early 1800s, most of the sea turtles were gone from around the Cayman Islands. So the first turtlers had to go far enough wide to hunt these animals. So they had to develop things like specialized schooners and turtle nets and catboats to help them with that craft, because they weren't doing it around home. First, they went to the keys off of southern Cuba, and they went to Puerto Rico, which most people didn't know. So they went over to the right to the east first. Eventually, things changed around. They had some issues because at that time it was a British territory. They were going to Spanish colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico. So they turned to go to the west instead, and they went towards Central America, Costa Rica and Nicaragua. Right, mostly Nicaragua, and they ended up eventually, as we know it, working off the Mosquito Keys in Nicaragua. They weren't even allowed in the mainland, and that was all political. So our relationship with sea turtles has changed over the years. Way back in the 1700s, all the way up to the 1960s, they were looked at as a source of meat, source of income. Right? This was the way that people provided for their families. It was a major industry in the Cayman Islands at the time, because Caymanians were uniquely poised and uniquely set up to exploit this resource. But then, as time changed and these animals became more and more endangered, then things changed. So the Cayman Turtle Centre came into being. In 1968, a wealthy foreign entrepreneur decided that he was going to exploit this resource and set up the Cayman Turtle Centre. At the time, it was called Mariculture Limited, and they set it up as a commercial sea turtle farm. The concept was, no animal has ever gone extinct once it's domesticated. If you think of the amount of stray dogs, cats, chickens in the case of Cayman, that still holds true. As long as there's a market for it, humans are not allowed to go extinct. And that same concept is what they used to bring the American bison back. Because once they started farming it and ranching it, the bison were able to reproduce, they were able to get land and funding, and now the bison roam the plains again. First of all, they saw the sea turtles as a source of meat, a source of income. Cayman Turtle Centre came into being and exploited that. They figured if you can commercially rear it, you can take the pressure off the wild population. That was the idea behind it. And they did. It did for a while. It worked well. They actually had an export market, especially the Asian market. So they were exporting meat through the Panama Canal to the Asian market. But in 1973, along came an organization called CITES, which means Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So what it is basically is a group of countries got together, they listed all the animal and plant species in the countries that were considered endangered, and they agreed that these animals and plants would not cross other borders. So they cut off the trade. And sea turtles, whales, things like that, that don't recognize international borders, were automatically considered endangered under CITES. So that meant that the market was cut off. Right? All we could do is supply the local market. So the government took over the company because it went bankrupt in 1983, and they renamed it Cayman Turtle Farm. And that's where it evolved. Since then, Cayman Turtle Farm has gone from a commercial enterprise to tourism, and from tourism to conservation. So now today we have Cayman Turtle Conservation Education Center, which is tourism, conservation, research, as well as the commercial side. And why the commercial side? Because poaching still exists. And as long as you can provide a sustainable alternative source of turtle meat that undersells poaching, that's why the sea turtle farming and meat production still goes on. As a result of all this work we've been doing over the years with conservation, research, and releases, right, we released over 35,000 turtles since the program began in the 1980s. What we found after a 2-year international study is that 90% of the breeding population of sea turtles can be traced back to our release program. So in other words, 9 out of 10 of the females that are coming up on the beach are either one of ours or the offspring of one of ours. So that was something that we did not expect. When the research started, basically what it did was it sampled the DNA of all the wild turtles they could find and compared it to the DNA of the ones in our program. And we were expecting something like maybe 30% or something like that. We did not expect 90%. Together with the conservation programs that the Department of Environment is doing with habitat protection and our releases, we're beginning to bring the sea turtles back to the Cayman Islands. Because turtles are not just pretty animals swimming around. They actually have an ecological role. They graze on the algae on the reefs. And with the oceans warming, you get in a lot more algae, a lot more sargassum. The more sea turtles you have, the less sargassum. because they're big marine herbivores. The old Caymanians call them sea buffaloes. Because that's what they did. They kept the sargassum at bay, and we don't have to pay them. And because of healthy reefs and healthy things, you get better diving, you get better fisheries, and of course it's our cultural icon. You can't have a turtle on the flag and not have turtles in the sea.
As you've learned, the turtle fishery dates back to the earliest years of our island's history, when turtles were hunted, consumed, and exported as a foundational element of culture and economy. Conservation and education are now key to preventing the population decline of these marine herbivores as we celebrate our heritage while ensuring the protection of our environment. Let's hear next from artist Chris Chrisitan, whose artworks are inspired by his own memories of Cayman's turtling and seafaring heritage.
But one of the things that inspired me to, paint the catboats fishing. I grew up in Boson Bay area in West Bay, and I was surrounded by uncles and family members who were building catboats, sailing catboats. My grandfather was a seafarer, and all my uncles, it was a part of my life. Going in the bushes, helping them get pop nuts, not knowing all the things about it at that time, but I just remember doing those things. You know, when they would go take turtles out the turtle crawls, and I just watch them build the catboats by hand. You know, everything was very simple tools back then, so very inspiring to watch the whole process from building it from scratch, watching it sail, and watching those boats still continue. Like some of my uncles that lives next door, Runner Powery and Crosby E-Banks, they're still building it. Being exposed to that, you want to immortalize those images. The images weren't really clear, so I created a kind of sepia colors to sort of like to light up the browns and to kind of show that it's sort of faded memories. It wasn't sort of disconnected in a sense, like the image is not all one solid piece, so it's like me puzzling it back mentally, trying to remember what they did or trying to realize what they did when I was growing up and trying to put all those components together. The image I found, I used to always go to the archives. I still enjoy doing that, going to the archives, looking at old photos, reading up on different articles that was written here, and voice recordings of older Caymanians doing things. So
Chris Chrisitan has used his art to celebrate our maritime traditions and strengthen the connection between generations. Chrisitan's artwork demonstrates that art can be a way of sharing stories and engaging current and future generations with maritime traditions like turtling. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the National Gallery's Culture and Heritage Series. If you'd like to learn more about turtles and turtling, visit our website at nationalgallery.org.ky/learn for additional resources and learning materials. Thank you to DART for their sponsorship of this series, and to Cayman Turtle Centre, Geddes Hislop, Chris Chrisitan, the Cayman Islands National Archive, and Armada Films for their support of this episode.